So, yeah, I think this is going to be more of a kind of practice-based kind of way into my subject, which is Hannah Weiner, and so I have a poem that I'll read, but I'll give us kind of framing context for first, then read the poem, and then offer some sort of other points that have kind of come to me since its research and since its composition and publishing. So I don't know how much to kind of introduce Hannah Weiner and the texts that this poem's kind of interacting with, but she, her text, The Fast, is the kind of the main book that I was thinking about, and this is a poem that's written in response to the note form of that book, The Fast, in its kind of archival documents, which was a huge body of diaries that represent the kind of clairvoyant stage of her work, which was her kind of terminology for a period of her life where she hallucinated text and words and had lots of kind of schizophrenic, symptomatic kind of hallucinations that she embraced as a kind of methodology, an artistic methodology and a mode of composition. So many years ago I went to the archive in San Diego to look at the kind of raw documentation of her clairvoyant journals. And The Fast, in its published form, begins with the introduction that she locked herself in her loft studio for, I think it was 3 weeks, and didn't eat, and kind of sought the hallucinatory state, kind of welcomed it. So it's problematic on many levels to kind of read this work. It was really kind of difficult because it's basically the expression of someone's very kind of critical mental illness. But she begins The Fast by saying, and I lived in the sink. I got inside the kitchen sink, and she offers a sort of logic for living in the sink, that it was made of a particular material, which was ceramic, and she'd become allergic to metal. And she could drink and she could pee without moving. So there was this kind of wonderful kind of logic. And the published form of The Fast, like I said, opens with that, and that's kind of offered as a premise. But when I was reading this in the archive, it was days and days and days before I got to this moment where she said, and then I decided to live in the sink. And there was something about that moment in the archive when you've been kind of, I don't know, we've all done archive research maybe, where you end up sort of leaving your body, you're alone, you're cold, you haven't spoken to another human for a really long time, apart from the sort of very helpful archivist maybe, and that kind of communion that you're having with your kind of the subject of your research becomes quite hallucinatory in itself. It becomes a sort of kind of communion, a kind of relationship that you're having with that text. So after days and days, the moment of the sink was a sort of coming together point of logics. Her logic, the logic of living in the sink, the temporal logic of the archive and my relationship to it. Suddenly I felt a kind of an arresting fusion, because to me it made perfect sense. It was like, yes, yeah, got it, yeah, live in the sink, okay. And there was no shock, and yet the lack of shock, my complete integration with her voice at that point, meant that the moving into the sink felt so natural that I caught myself out in that moment of being something other to a researcher. And the fact that the kind of material, the fact that it's an expression of schizophrenic episode, makes that relationship quite disarming anyway. You can't have that typical, I didn't feel you could have that kind of typical research object relationship. It felt disabled somewhat anyway. So there was a different kind of care that different kind of study, which felt more devotional, or like felt troubled, that kind of devotional mode of study. And I didn't ever know what to do with these notes, so I had notes on her notes, and I, looking at them side by side, sometimes it looked a bit like, what am I even doing, writing up these kind of strange hallucinatory diaries, and what do I do with my notes on these notes? And yeah, it just turned into a poem. Because it felt like writing a paper, or writing a journal article about this sink, about this moment in the sink. It never felt like it worked. So it's turned into a poem, but I think since then I've had some ideas which I'll offer after this, but yeah. So this is Hannah Weiner's Sink. Somewhere in San Diego, under a flight path, there is a bungalow that you can reach by train from Los Angeles. I travelled there to sleep and read. On the third day, I cried as she described her decision to live in the kitchen sink, a space to both urinate and drink without moving, a bay to study herself. The men I stayed with offered me earplugs and told me to look out for the seals from the bus window. I got off the bus and walked right up to them. I went back to the library and I got in the sink with her. To pee on the burns on her toes, I agreed. I caught myself, regarding one perspective from another, nodding. She got in the sink. The sink is a fixing point of institution and hallucination. There we were in the sink. Good idea. For 3 weeks. The librarian explained. The shower's flow was inadequate. Pouring water onto body parts eased pain. The shower was metal and she had become magnetic. The sink was ceramic. She didn't have a bathtub. Back in my room, I chewed. I could hear the errors. The communal curve of her visions centred in the sink. A small dog sat on the edge. The sink is a state. Making statements in the sink of the drain means you are not opposed to will. Everything you write from here addresses faith in utensils. Time is done. It's time to get up, have a shower, pack for a day, link things. It's cold in the reading room. There are seals. Nothing until she's still in the sink. Being in the sink makes you different to the rules of the home. It's a new way to be at home, in self, in body. Yes, it's a trial by error process. Let's think of the women in art history, sitting at her toilet. We are behind her. She has her arm raised and is lancing her era's attitude towards us from her nipple in inches and its niches. This is a version of that. She found an experimental position. She found a space to recover, to make. Looking for her, the sink is a space of not yet and cure. Burning little moons onto her breast, a thing done to meaning, and my love of this underneath knowledge. Inventive, I lay down along a route of study. Her writing is in colour-coded pens. I learnt the language of her paranoia, red, green, purple. There is a purple man at the door. Don't answer it. The librarian disagrees with me, but we are not speaking. Language transformed her toes. It was in her hair, the scratching of cloth on skin as pain or thirst. Language like water in a hole. My hero is starving. I am reading. I did dry her hands. I do have a spiritual convention. The energy, the luxury. I'm begging to hold her paper. the sink in place of arthritic pain. I was in the country, aren't I? Peeing in it, washing it off, having time to think. I got in the sink, didn't I? So, since then, quite a lot of the collection actually is about tenancy and housing. And it occurred to me that the sink is actually quite a lot to do with housing and tenancy. Throughout the notes also, she has quite a lot of typical tenant issues. The sink gets blocked at one point. The fact that the sink is blocked is actually what kind of pulls her out of the hallucination kind of state at the end, and realises she has to let someone in because they've got a plunger. Because there's quite a lot of people trying to kind of come and check on her, but she's made this kind of pact, this commitment, this contract to kind of take over this space and turn it into a kind of performance that she's documenting. So she's in this contract with herself, but the contract with the tenancy also kind of keeps interrupting. Like the sink is actually a kind of contingent facility on her tenancy. So she has to let someone in. And that's the way they get in, because they're trying to offer food, and she's like, no, don't come in, you're purple, I can't let you in. And then at one point they said, but your sink is blocked and I have a plunger. She said, is the plunger metal? And they're like, no, we promise. And they come in. The furnace doesn't work, and she has this kind of anxiety about telling the landlady, and that's a kind of very relatable moment. But this is 1970, and she's in a loft on 28th Street in West Chelsea, which is around the corner from Caroline Schiemann. So there's a lot of artists around, there's lots of performance art, there's lots of turning your domestic space, in women's art particularly, turning your domestic space into a sort of conceptualised art project. So there's a kind of lineage, and she's done that before as well. She had another work called Open House, was kind of inviting people into her domestic workspace where she was designing underwear, and that was another kind of performance moment. So she's closed the doors, but it's a public kind of, it's a performance. So the sink in that sense is this sort of arrival point of performance and tenancy coming together. It's a tenanted space, it's literally tenanted in that moment. It's kind of almost synecdochally kind of tenanted in her kind of moving into not just the kitchen but the sink itself. It's reliant on the maintenance, it's reliant on the sort of tenanted contract. It's also a stage for her in that moment. It becomes this kind of performance stage, and it's a conduit for her own body, or her own body becomes a conduit to it, in the same way that any kind of performance act kind of with objects kind of creates that kind of condition of between your body and the object. So I'm kind of thinking about moving into thinking about the sink, which I still can't let go of. I'm still in it. I'm still in the sink with her. Is thinking about the material kind of reading of this, the kind of objects of housing, and thinking about a tenanted lyric. Her writing is kind of often. The clairvoyant journals are often interpreted and close read in terms of this kind of hyperlinguistic expression, but there is this kind of historical materialist kind of way into it as well, in terms of the contract of the tenancy, the contract of the performance space, the contract with time and her own, and her body, creating a kind of tenanted lyric that she's kind of occupying, but being expressive with. So thank you.